Welcome to this explainer. We're going to synthesize some seriously profound historical texts to figure out how history is actually made from the bottom up. We usually learn history as this neat, tidy timeline of presidents, generals, and treaties. But what happens when we flip the script? Today, we're diving into the mechanics of historical resistance. We'll be drawing heavily on Howard Zinn's landmark work, A People's History of the United States, and we're really going to zero in on Chapter 17, Or Does It Explode? We're looking at the dynamics of class, race, and systemic pushback, bringing in powerful insights from Eduardo Galeano, Michael Parenti, Che Guevara, and George Jackson.
Okay, let's jump right in with a massive hook from Zinn. He challenges us to question who actually writes our history. Think about it. When we crack open a standard textbook, we're almost always reading the memory of states. But Zinn poses a pretty critical question here. Must we accept that state-sanctioned memory as our own? It really makes you realize that the act of writing history, and reading it for that matter, is literally never neutral.
In his book, Zinn points out that nations just aren't these big, happy, unified communities. Viewing history purely through the eyes of the state, well, that actually conceals the fierce conflicts boiling right under the surface. We're talking conflicts between conquerors and the conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers. When we gloss over these divisions, we totally miss the actual engines driving historical change.
So here's how we'll break down the anatomy of resistance today. 1. Rethinking the historical record. 2. The architecture of plunder. 3. Suppressing popular revolutions. 4. The inevitable explosion. And 5. Mechanics of resistance.
Let's hit Section 1. Rethinking the historical record. Beyond the statesman. Let's see how changing our lens completely alters the story.
This perfectly illustrates the stark contrast between a top-down view of 19th century Europe and the gritty reality experienced by, well, everyone else. On the left, you've got the standard history approach. Think Henry Kissinger, writing about how peace in Europe was restored by diplomacy among a few elite national leaders. But Zinn counters this on the right. Because for the factory workers in England, the farmers in France, or the colonized peoples in Asia and Africa, this wasn't a restored peace at all. It was a world defined by conquest and exploitation.
The crucial takeaway here is that in a world of victims and executioners, looking at history from the viewpoint of the airwalks, the slaves, or the workers changes absolutely everything. Zinn argues that presenting a country's history as the history of one big family is just a myth. It's a myth designed to hide those fierce conflicts of interest. Once you make the choice not to be on the side of the executioners, the historical record literally demands to be rewritten from the bottom up.
Moving on to Section 2, the architecture of plunder, the open veins. To really grasp resistance, authors like Eduardo Galeano and Michael Parenti argue we've got to look at the economic systems underneath it all.
Just look at the massive scale of extraction in Latin America. Galeano points to these key resources that were relentlessly pulled out of the earth to fuel foreign development. From the early Spanish lust for gold and silver, to the agricultural monarchy of sugar, all the way up to the modern corporate extraction of petroleum and copper. The history of these regions is completely tied to the resources beneath their soil, resources systematically drained to enrich outside empires.
And this leads to a really tragic paradox. Galeano points out that places privileged by nature have, quite literally, been cursed by history. The poverty of Latin America, he argues, isn't some natural state or a failure of the people. It's the direct mathematical consequence of the wealth of other nations. They are poor exactly because the ground they tread is rich.
Which brings us to Section 3, suppressing popular revolutions, maintaining the order. Because of course, that extraction doesn't happen without major pushback.
When the wealth of the land is being exported, the people living there inevitably try to reclaim it. Michael Parenti outlines how the suppression of popular revolutions, from the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century to modern interventions in Latin America, was systematically used to protect foreign wealth and crush the working class. It's a long legacy of military and political interventions designed explicitly to maintain a specific economic order, often at a tremendous cost to human life.
But despite this massive suppression, Zinn observes something fascinating. He notes the existence of what he calls a permanent adversarial culture that's constantly simmering beneath the surface. Even when political consensus seems totally solid on the outside, there are millions of citizens who refuse to go along with the elite consensus, whether through active protest or just silent noncompliance. They form this undercurrent of resistance that never truly goes away.
Let's jump into Section 4, the inevitable explosion, or does it explode? This is where we deep dive into Chapter 17 of Zinn's book, looking at the absolute breaking point of systemic oppression.
In Chapter 17,
Zinn meticulously details the Black Revolt of the 1950s and 60s. He notes that while the uprising, from the Montgomery bus boycott to the massive waves of sit-ins, came as a shock to the establishment, it really shouldn't have. The living memory of slavery, systemic segregation, and daily humiliation basically guaranteed an explosion. Borrowing from Langston Hughes' poetry, Zinn points out that a dream deferred cannot simply be contained forever. You can suppress a movement physically, sure, but you can't legislate away the memory of generations of injustice. For these populations, revolt isn't just an abstract concept, it is always just an inch below the surface.
That inevitable explosion is captured so vividly in the prison writings of George Jackson. His book, Blood in My Eye, nails this tension perfectly. Jackson spent over a decade in brutal prison conditions, and he used that time to study history and economics. He argued for transforming what the state labeled a criminal mentality into a highly conscious revolutionary mentality. It's a stark, uncompromising look at resistance from the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, reflecting that exact boiling point Zinn talks about.
Building right on Jackson's thoughts, Angela Davis articulates this total awakening of the oppressed. She presents this moment as a profound shift. It's the point where people make an unwavering commitment to destroy the obstacles keeping them down. They're aiming to transcribe their vision of a new world directly into the historical record, often with their own flesh and blood. It's an incredibly powerful description of total systemic rejection.
Finally, Section 5, Mechanics of Resistance, taking up arms. When that explosion happens, what does it actually look like on the ground?
Che Guevara introduced the concept of the FOCO to describe how resistance gets catalyzed. The idea here is that you don't necessarily have to sit around waiting for all the objective conditions for a massive revolution to magically align. Instead, a small, highly dedicated nucleus of revolutionaries, the FOCO, can spark widespread resistance and inspire the masses to push back against ruling institutions.
Guevara strictly defines the guerrilla fighter not just as a combatant, but as a social reformer. Their purpose is to embody the people's angry protest, take up arms specifically to defend the unarmed, and ultimately completely smash the mold of the ruling institutions. In this framework, armed struggle is presented as a direct response to the systemic violence of the state.
But we have to remember, this resistance carries a devastating personal cost. The source material shares this profoundly tragic moment regarding George Jackson's reaction to the violent death of his teenage brother, Jonathan. Jonathan was killed attempting to free convicts. Jackson couldn't even find a marker for his brother's grave, so he sent a blank check for a headstone and signed it, "Blood in My Eye." It's a heartbreaking reminder that beneath all these grand theories of history and revolution, there are real human beings experiencing immense grief and paying the ultimate price.
Pulling all of this together, Howard Zinn reminds us that while the elite might seem to hold all the cards, history is ultimately defined by the astonishing capacity of ordinary people to assert their humanity and demand change. Even in the darkest, most pessimistic times, uncovering this people's history proves that the human spirit has an infinite capacity for rebellion. It holds out the constant possibility of surprise.
So Zinn concludes his massive historical account by suggesting that history isn't just something that happened to people in the past, it's an ongoing race. We can choose to sit on the sidelines and just watch, or we can choose to participate. But knowing what we know now about how history is made from the bottom up, which will you choose? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.